There's a woman sitting alone in a coffee shop right now, and she's not waiting for anyone. She brought a book she's not really reading. She likes it this way. And if you asked her why, she'd probably shrug and say something like, I just enjoy my own company. But if you dug a little deeper, if you actually sat with her and asked about her childhood, you'd find something surprising, something that explains everything. Because here's the truth almost nobody talks about. People who genuinely enjoy solitude, the ones who aren't lonely, who aren't hiding, who actually feel more like themselves when no one else is around, usually didn't become that way by accident. Something happened. Somewhere back in childhood, a pattern got written into them, quietly, without anyone noticing, and that pattern followed them into adulthood, wearing a completely different name. Think about it. We're social creatures. From the moment we're born, we're wired to seek connection. Babies cry not just because they're hungry, but because being alone, physically alone, can feel like a threat to survival. So when you meet an adult who genuinely prefers their own space, who feels calmer alone than in a crowded room, who turns down invitations not out of anxiety, but out of actual preference, that's not the default setting. That's a rewire. And rewires don't happen for no reason. So what actually happened to these people when they were kids? Stick with me, because this gets uncomfortable fast, and then it gets strangely hopeful. Let's start with the most common thread, the one that shows up again and again when psychologists study people who are comfortable alone. It's not that they were unloved. It's more subtle than that. Many of them grew up in homes where emotional needs weren't consistently met. Not necessarily abusive homes. Not necessarily broken homes. Sometimes they were homes that looked completely fine from the outside. 2 parents, decent income, no obvious chaos. But inside that house, something was missing. Psychologist John Ice Webb calls this childhood emotional neglect. And it's one of the most invisible forms of childhood pain, because there's no event to point to, no single day you can blame. It's not what happened to you, it's what didn't happen. Nobody hit you, nobody screamed at you, but nobody really saw you either. Nobody asked how your day actually felt. Nobody noticed when you were sad and quietly withdrawing instead of talking about it. Your physical needs got met, sure. Food, shelter, a ride to school. But your emotional world, the part of you that needed someone to say, I see you and what you're feeling matters, that part often went unattended. And here's where it gets interesting, because a child in that situation faces an impossible problem. They still need connection. They're still wired for it. But connection keeps failing to deliver what they actually need. So what does a child do when reaching out for comfort keeps coming up empty? They stop reaching. Not consciously. Not as some dramatic decision. It happens slowly, almost like a habit forming in reverse. Every time a child expresses a need and gets nothing back, or gets dismissed, or gets told to stop being so sensitive, a tiny lesson gets recorded somewhere deep in their nervous system. The lesson is simple and brutal. My needs are inconvenient. Depending on others leads to disappointment. It's safer to just handle things myself. Sound familiar to anyone? Maybe not you, maybe someone you know. That friend who never asks for help, even when you can tell they're drowning. That co-worker who handles every crisis alone and gets almost offended when someone offers support. That's not strength, at least not in the way we usually think about strength. That's often a survival strategy that got built in childhood and never got updated. Now let's talk about another version of this story, because emotional neglect isn't the only road that leads here. There's another kind of childhood that produces adults who love solitude, and it's almost the opposite situation on the surface. This is the child who grew up in a chaotic home. Maybe there was conflict. Maybe there was unpredictability, a parent with mood swings, financial stress that created constant tension, arguments that seemed to explode out of nowhere. In homes like this, the outside world, meaning other people, becomes associated with danger. Not physical danger necessarily, but emotional danger, unpredictability. For a child growing up in that kind of environment, their bedroom or the corner of the yard, or wherever they could go to be by themselves, that space becomes sacred. It becomes the one place where nothing could hurt them, where the volume of the world went quiet. Psychologists who study attachment styles have long noted that children raised in unpredictable environments often develop what's called an avoidant attachment style. And avoidant doesn't mean they don't want connection. It means they learned very early That connection came with risk, and solitude came with peace. Here's where it gets darker and also more compassionate at the same time. That child, sitting alone in their room, wasn't rejecting people because they were antisocial. They were protecting themselves. Solitude wasn't a preference back then. It was a shield, and shields, once built, tend to stick around long after the danger has passed. That's actually one of the strangest things about the human mind. We build defenses of the world we grew up in, and then we carry those same defenses into a completely different world as adults, even when they no longer make sense. But wait, there's another piece of this puzzle that most people never even consider, and it might be the most surprising one yet. Some kids who grow up loving solitude weren't neglected or traumatized at all. Some of them were just wired differently from the start. Psychologist Elaine Aron did groundbreaking research on what she called highly sensitive people, and she found that somewhere around 15 to 20% of the population processes sensory and emotional information much more deeply than everyone else. These are kids who get overwhelmed in loud classrooms, kids who cry at movies other kids barely notice, kids who pick up on tension in a room before anyone says a word out loud. For a highly sensitive child, being around other people, even in a completely loving, healthy environment, can be exhausting. Not because people are bad, because processing all that social information, all those tones of voice and facial expressions and unspoken moods, takes real mental energy. And solitude for these kids isn't running away from something painful. It's recovery. It's how their nervous system resets. Now here's something fascinating. If a highly sensitive child grows up in a home that understands this about them, that lets them retreat and recharge without shaming them for it, they often grow into adults who love solitude in the healthiest possible way. They know when they need space. They take it without guilt, and then they come back to the world refreshed and genuinely present with people. But if that same sensitive child grows up in a home that doesn't understand their need for quiet, a home where they're constantly told to toughen up, stop being so dramatic, why can't you just be normal like your brother? Something painful happens instead. Their natural need for solitude gets tangled up with shame. They start to believe there's something wrong with them for needing space. And that shame follows them into adulthood too, except now it's disguised as either forced extroversion, pretending to be fine in crowds while quietly falling apart inside, or a much more guarded, almost offensive version of solitude, where being alone stops feeling peaceful and starts feeling like the only safe option left. Can you see how two people can end up in the exact same place, alone by choice, for completely different reasons? One person's solitude is a garden they tend with care. Another person's solitude is a bunker they built to survive. Let's talk about another childhood pattern, because this one shows up constantly and almost nobody names it correctly. It's called parentification, and it happens when a child ends up taking on adult emotional responsibilities way too early. Maybe one parent struggled with depression, and the child became the one who checked in on them, who tried to keep them okay. Maybe there was addiction in the house, and the child learned to read moods like a weather forecaster, always scanning for the next storm. Maybe the parents divorced messily, and the child became the emotional mediator, the peacekeeper, the one who held everyone else together while nobody held them. Kids in this position grow up fast. Too fast. They become remarkably competent, remarkably responsible, remarkably good at managing other people's emotions. But there's a cost, and the cost is this. They never really got to just be a kid who could fall apart sometimes without worrying about the ripple effect. They learned that their own feelings had to wait, because someone else's feelings always seem more urgent. What happens when that child grows up? Often, they become adults who feel strange, almost unexplainable relief when they're finally alone. Not because they dislike people, because being around people, even people they love, activates an old pattern of hypervigilance, of monitoring, of managing. Alone, for the first time all day, they don't have to read anyone's mood. They don't have to anticipate anyone's needs. They can just exist. And that feeling, that specific relief of not having to perform emotional labor for a moment, becomes something they start to crave. This is where psychology becomes genuinely fascinating, because it reveals something most people get completely backwards about introverted, solitude-loving adults. We tend to assume these people just don't care about connection, but that's almost never true. Many of them care so deeply, so intensely that connection without boundaries becomes overwhelming. Solitude isn't the absence of caring. Sometimes it's the direct result of caring too much for too long without anyone ever checking on them in return. Now, let's bring in an idea that changes the whole conversation, something psychiatrist Donald Winnicott wrote about decades ago. He talked about something called the false self, a kind of protective mask children develop when their authentic emotions weren't welcomed or understood by their caregivers. If a child's real feelings, anger, sadness, disappointment, kept getting met with punishment or dismissal, that child learns to build a socially acceptable version of themselves instead, a performance, a self that's easier for everyone else to handle. Living behind a false self is exhausting in a way that's hard to describe unless you felt it. It's like wearing a costume that never comes off. And here's the connection to solitude. For someone who grew up needing a false self just to feel safe, being alone becomes the only place where the mask can finally come off. No audience means no performance. That's why some people describe their alone time not as boring or empty, but as the only time they actually feel like themselves. Everywhere else, they're managing an image. Alone, they just get to exist. That changes everything about how we should think about this, doesn't it? What looks like someone avoiding people might actually be someone finally getting a break from constantly editing themselves for other people's comfort. Let's talk about only children for a moment, because there's actual research here worth mentioning. Growing up without siblings often means growing up with a lot more unstructured alone time by default. Kids in that position frequently develop rich inner worlds early, imaginary games, deep engagement with books, an ability to entertain themselves that other kids, constantly surrounded by siblings, never had to build. This isn't inherently a wound. In many cases, it's simply a skill that got practiced early and stuck around. The child learns that their own mind is interesting enough to spend time in, and that's a genuinely powerful thing to carry into adulthood, as long as it wasn't paired with isolation from outside friendships too. But here's an important distinction, because this entire conversation can easily get confused if we don't separate two things that look similar but are actually opposites. There's a difference between solitude and loneliness, and it's one of the most important distinctions in psychology that almost nobody explains clearly. Loneliness is the pain of wanting connection and not having it. It's an ache. It's a hunger that doesn't get fed. Solitude, real solitude, is completely different. It's being alone and feeling complete anyway. Researchers have found that people can be lonely in a crowded room, surrounded by people, and completely at peace sitting by themselves in an empty apartment. The external situation, alone or with others, doesn't determine which one you're experiencing. Your internal relationship with yourself does. This is the piece that ties everything together. Children who grew up feeling emotionally safe alone with themselves, even if that safety came from difficult circumstances, often develop a capacity for genuine solitude as adults. But children who grew up feeling like they had to disappear, had to shrink, had to hide their real feelings just to avoid conflict or disappointment, sometimes carry loneliness with them even when they're by themselves, because the habit of self-abandonment doesn't just vanish once the environment changes. Here's where this gets hopeful, though, because up until now this might sound like a fairly heavy explanation for why some people end up preferring solitude. But there's something incredibly important buried inside all of this. The same mechanism that creates painful isolation can also, under the right conditions, create something genuinely beautiful. Think about some of history's most original thinkers, the writers, the scientists, the artists who produce work that reshape how we understand the world. A striking number of them were known for deeply valuing solitude. Emily Dickinson wrote nearly 1,800 poems, and for much of her adult life, she rarely left her family home, choosing an intensely private, solitary existence that she seemed to find not just tolerable but necessary for her work. Isaac Newton did some of his most important thinking during a period of forced isolation when Cambridge closed due to plague, spending long stretches essentially alone with his ideas. This isn't a coincidence. There's something about undistracted solitude that allows the mind to go places it simply can't reach in constant social stimulation. Psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who spent his career studying what he called flow states, those moments of deep, absorbed focus where time seems to disappear, found that flow almost always requires a certain kind of solitude, even if other people are technically nearby. You can't fully enter that state while managing someone else's emotional needs at the same time. Solitude, it turns out, isn't just where some people recover from pain. It's also where deep thinking, creativity, and self-understanding actually happen. So maybe the child who learned to prefer their own company because the world felt unpredictable or unsafe was, without knowing it, also building a skill that would later become one of their greatest strengths: the ability to sit with themselves, the ability to think without needing constant external validation, the ability to create, to reflect, to simply be without requiring an audience. That doesn't erase the pain of how that skill was built. It's worth being honest about that. A child shouldn't have to learn self-reliance because nobody else showed up reliably. A child shouldn't have to build a fortress instead of getting to just be a kid who trusted the adults around them completely. But psychology has a strange, almost redemptive quality to it sometimes, where the very thing that once protected you from something painful can, with enough awareness, be reshaped into something that serves you on purpose instead of by accident. Here's a question worth sitting with. If you recognize yourself somewhere in this, if solitude has always felt more comfortable to you than most people seem to think is normal, what would it look like to ask yourself honestly which version of solitude you're actually living in? Is it the peaceful kind? The kind where you choose to be alone because you genuinely enjoy your own thoughts, and you could just as easily choose connection if you wanted it? Or is it the protective kind, the kind that shows up more like a wall than a preference, where the idea of really letting someone in still feels vaguely threatening, even when you can't quite explain why? Most people never ask themselves this question, and honestly, that's understandable. It's uncomfortable. It requires looking back at childhood moments that might not have felt significant at the time, but were quietly shaping how you relate to people for decades afterward. But here's the encouraging part. The part that makes all of this worth talking about instead of just leaving it as some sad explanation for why certain people ended up a certain way. Patterns that were built can be rebuilt. Nervous systems that learn solitude equals safety can also learn slowly, carefully. That connection can be safe too, at least with the right people, in the right amounts, on your own terms. This isn't about forcing yourself to become someone who suddenly loves parties or needs constant company. That would be just as inauthentic as pretending your need for alone time doesn't exist. It's about widening the range of what feels okay. Learning that you can enjoy deep, real connection with another person without it costing you your sense of self. Learning that needing something from someone else isn't weakness. It's just being human. There's a particular kind of moment that a lot of people who grew up this way eventually experience. Sometimes in therapy, sometimes just through a slow accumulation of life experience. It's the moment they realize their love of solitude was never really about disliking people. It was about protecting a part of themselves that once felt unprotected. And once that part finally feels safe, sometimes solitude starts to feel less like a requirement and more like an option. Something they choose because it feels good, not something they retreat into because everything else feels risky. That's honestly one of the most freeing realizations a person can have about themselves. Not because solitude is bad. It isn't. Some of the most emotionally healthy people you'll ever meet deeply value their alone time and always will. But there's a real difference between choosing solitude from a place of wholeness and defaulting into it from a place of old, unhealed protection. And most people who love being alone have never stopped to ask themselves which one they're actually doing. So think back to that woman in the coffee shop from the beginning. Maybe she's not avoiding anyone. Maybe she spent years learning that her own company was the one relationship that never let her down, and now she simply enjoys it, the way you'd enjoy time with an old, trusted friend. Or maybe there's a version of her that still hasn't quite let anyone else in, not because she doesn't want to, but because some younger version of her decided a long time ago that it was safer not to try. Either way, there's nothing wrong with her, and if you recognize pieces of yourself in any part of this, there's nothing wrong with you either. The child who learned to be alone did the best they could with what they had. But the adult you are now gets to decide what solitude actually means going forward. Not a hiding place. Not a wound wearing a calmer name. Just a choice made freely by someone who finally knows their own company was never something to be ashamed of. If this gave you a new way of understanding yourself, or maybe someone close to you, do me a favor and hit like on this video. It genuinely helps this kind of content reach more people who need it. Subscribe if you want more honest, research-backed explorations of why we are the way we are. And if you know someone who'd relate to this, go ahead and share it with them. Sometimes the most important thing you can give someone is a feeling that they finally make sense.